Well, it's 1 o'clock, so I think we should get rolling. So welcome everyone. This is the webinar on facilitating engaging asynchronous discussion boards. So let's introduce you to who we are. So I'm Erica. I'm the Associate Director of the Writing Hub.
And I'm Karen. I'm a Senior Instructional Designer in the Digital Learning Hub.
And lurking around in the background is me, Matt Nelson. I'm the Director of the Writing Hub. So we're all part of the Teaching and Learning Commons, which offers all kinds of support for both students and educators. I would bet money that y'all have interacted with us, if not before this last week, probably during this last week, somewhere or another. But we will share contact information at the end and give you a rundown of the kinds of things that you might reach out to individual hubs to ask about. But just know that we're here with you and here to support you.
Awesome. So here's what we're going to be talking about in the webinar today. I just want to go ahead and preface that we have lots of slides. All of the slides, not all of them, but many of the slides have embedded links within them. We'll be making the slides available online. We'll be sending them to you directly, so you'll have access to all of the slides. So if we don't spend a lot of time in one particular slide, just know that you'll have access to it. So what we're going to think about today is how to design discussion boards that are interesting, engaging, and have some variety to encourage student engagement or to achieve other kinds of purposes. So we'll talk about some key considerations in setting up the boards, some practices for setting up the boards and running them week to week or whatever frequency you want that help encourage more engaging discussion. And we'll briefly talk about strategies for grading and giving feedback on discussion boards. At the end of this, you'll probably still have questions about the pedagogy, questions about Canvas, and that's still okay. We're here to talk with you. You can schedule one-on-one consultations with us. You can email us, and we'll do our best to help you. So if you don't get all your questions answered today, that's totally fine. So here's some Zoom navigation basics. So if you haven't been on Zoom before, I know we all were recently talking about that we're all becoming proficient in Zoom in weird ways. But the microphone at the bottom, that's to turn on and off, so you can mute yourself. The video camera is to turn on and off your webcam so that we can see you or not. You can invite others to the webinar by clicking the invite link. There's options in the participants window. You can raise your hand, you can give a thumbs up, you can do yes, no questions, things like that, so you can use that. We're sharing our screen, so we ask you not to share your screen today, but in the future, if you want to have students share their screen, or if you want to show others how to do it, you would use that green button. There's the chat. We'll ask you to log questions in the chat. We'll stop pretty frequently for Q&A. So if you want to put questions in the chat, just to write them down, use the chat as a kind of note page for yourself. Matt will also be paying attention to questions in the chat and will be interrupting us as appropriate. We're recording the session, and we see that on our end. You won't, is the record on the participant end as well, Karen?
You can see it in a couple different places on the screen, but it's not in the same place that we have it.
Awesome. And then, of course, you can click leave the meeting if you want to go. One thing we're going to also ask you to do at certain points of the webinar is to raise your hand when you have a question. So you can log questions in the chat. We'll go back to the chat during the Q&A. But if you have a pretty immediate question that you want to ask right then and there and you think it's appropriate to do so, click raise your hand. So let's quickly show you how to do that. So if you click onto the participants box, you should see an option that is a little blue hand. So everyone, if you're interested, raise your hand so you know how to do it. No one's doing it. That's fine.
No, everybody's doing it, actually.
Oh, I just can't see it. I made you the host. Oh, dang. So I can't see it. All right, great. So those are just some Zoom navigation basics. It also is a good idea when you're starting off in your remote instruction to give this information to the students. So we're going to try to model these kinds of practices for you. Showing the students how to navigate within Zoom is a really helpful idea. So you can copy this slide. When we send you the slides, you can access a version of this Google slide to embed in your own materials. So here's some discussion guidelines and community guidelines that we just want to kick off. Again, this is just a good idea for orienting your students to having these kinds of tech-mediated interactions. So they're not just for the webinar today. We think this is a good practice to help students get used to how to interact in these ways with these technologies. So a couple of quick discussion guidelines. Keep yourself on mute to try to minimize background noise, especially in small groups. Enable your video if you can. It really helps keep people engaged. Raise the hand, use the raise hand function before you interject, or log questions in the chat. Try to be respectful, be open, thoughtful, things like that. In general, with the community, we are asking folks to model the kind of interactions you hope students will have in this space. So act in the way that you'd like students to act. Your interaction style. So if you tend to speak up a lot in small groups, or if you tend to be quiet, just be mindful of that and try to make space for others to contribute. But with that said, if others aren't contributing, don't be afraid of the silence. Awkward silence is weird in a classroom. It's 10 times weirder in Zoom. And it's okay if there's awkward silence moments. Try not to multitask if that's at all possible. I know we're all really busy these days, but to the extent that you can, turn off other technologies and keep your focus on the webinar. Okay, so we're going to kick things off. Key considerations in designing discussion boards. So we'll talk about how to think about the pedagogy of discussion boards and then options that you can enable in Canvas when setting them up. So quickly ponder, how would a discussion board response differ from other kinds of writing that students might be doing in your class? So if you assign writing in your class, think about how the writing that would be required to respond to a discussion board would be altogether different. How would it be different in content, in style, in your own expectations? So quickly think through that and maybe jot down some ideas for yourself. If you're not assigning writing, or even if you are, also think about how engaging in a discussion board would be different from other kinds of learning activities you're designing. And the key point with both of these questions is to ask, what are you trying to achieve with discussion boards? What is it that a discussion board is going to enable for you and enable for the students? So just think through that for a few moments. All right, so you might have some thoughts. Here's some potential purposes that you might have thought of or that you might not have thought of when designing discussion boards. So I'll talk through a few of these, but all of these might sound really good and interesting to you. So one purpose for a discussion board is asynchronous attendance. So that would be a passive way to make sure students are just logging on, that they're staying engaged, that they see whatever you post in Canvas. There's passive participation points, so a way to set a minimum threshold for participation in the course grade. You can use discussion boards as opportunities to get feedback on your teaching, to see how students are feeling about the material, what they're confused on, and then adjust your approach. So usually we advocate for getting student feedback at the midpoint of the quarter, and you can use a discussion board for that. You could use discussion boards for building communities, helping students, asking them the kinds of questions to help them get to know each other and connect. And I think the purpose that lots of us think about and care about a lot is that we want the discussion boards to engage students with the material and motivate them to be interested in the material and to get further into the material and go deeper with their engagement. So these are some potential purposes.
Can I interrupt for 1 second, Erica? Sorry, I promised you no interruption. Here I am. I realized that we may not have put in some of the campus context for why we think this particular webinar is so important, which is about asynchronous engagement with students. I'll turn on my video. I'm just this disembodied head. Hi, disembodied voice. Karen, I don't know if that's something you wanted to weigh in on, but I would just say it as, the campus is really pushing instructors to think about asynchronous engagement with students rather than thinking, oh, we'll just do a live lecture and require all students to attend that as though it were sort of class in a classroom. We're really being pushed, if not mandated, to make sure that things are available to students asynchronously, because there's so much upheaval in their lives that we need to be able to make it possible for them to connect when and how they can. So I just wanted to throw that in just as big picture context for all this.
Definitely. So I should say that all of these purposes could be done asynchronously, right? All of these purposes would be achieved asynchronously, not necessarily like live. And you might think all of these purposes sound good. You might say, well, yeah, I want to take attendance and also get some feedback and motivate their engagement. And so that's all good and fine. But it's hard to design a discussion board that serves multiple purposes at the same time. So ask yourself, maybe with each particular board, what's my purpose for this board? What am I trying to get out of this? What do I want to be able to achieve by assigning this to the students? And whatever your purpose is, make it explicit to the students. The more you can tell them what you're after and the intention behind what you're after, the more they're going to be able to meet your expectations because they have a sense of what you need. So determine your purpose at the beginning and then make that clear to the students. And then let your purpose guide your approach. It can guide your approach to the quantity of boards that you set up at the beginning, or how many of those boards that students have to respond to, how frequently they need to respond. It can guide your approach to how you ask questions, how you set up the different kinds of questions if you want questions to be routine or different kinds of themes. We'll talk more about question types later. And it can guide your expectations for how students engage with the course material. And finally, most importantly, your purpose should really be aligned with your feedback and grading practices. And again, we'll talk more about that later as well. So I want to just quickly plug that you don't necessarily need a discussion board. There's lots of ways to have a discussion, to have asynchronous participation that isn't a discussion board. So don't use a discussion board when something else will do. So assignments in Canvas are pretty straightforward. Well, they shouldn't say they're straightforward. They have lots of options, but you can have a lot of different kinds of assignments. We generally think of assignments as summative, meaning they are graded and that grade goes into the student's course grade. But you can also create assignments that are graded and assessed as a kind of formative assessment, meaning they're pretty low stakes and they're meant to gauge students' engagement, their interest, their confusion, their comprehension, things like that. Assignments are really useful when you have a high product focus, when you care about the thing that they're turning in and what that thing looks like and what it sounds like. Assignments might be better than a discussion board. An assignment might be better if you're more interested in the thing that they're turning in and whether that demonstrates effort and comprehension than interaction. On the other side of the spectrum are journals. So journals are really minimally structured, and there's no journal option in Canvas, but you can have students share a Google document with you and give them internal deadlines that you set up in the Canvas calendar to be journal response deadlines. And that's where students can share private reflections, challenges with the material. That's a high process focus. You're allowing sort of thoughts on page coming out, and it's okay. So, and in between those two things are these discussion boards. Discussion boards are moderately structured. It gives you an opportunity to interact with the students' thoughts in progress. So if you think about the way discussion boards create an opportunity for you to intervene in a thought process early or midway, but before an assignment is due, before they have to turn in something that has higher stakes, that's what a discussion board can be really useful. And of course, it's also useful when you really need to have students interacting with each other with the material.
Erica, there's one question in the chat that somebody had just asked, like, sort of define discussion board in this context, like just a really, maybe just an overall, I realized the big picture context maybe we hadn't set, and maybe this just to define it before we go into all the purposes and the values of it.
So Karen, do you want to describe what the difference is in Canvas between discussion boards and these other options, asynchronous options?
Yeah, absolutely. So think of a discussion as a conversation that happens online. So it basically is something where there's something that kicks off a conversation or a prompt, and then students respond to both the prompt and to each other. So that is the basic definition of a discussion board. An assignment, on the other hand, just to kind of make things a little bit different, is something where the student sends something to the instructor and only the instructor for review and grading. Does that answer the question and make sense?
So there's a public and a public feature, a publicness to discussion boards, and typically, though not always, there's a sense of sort of a question and a response and maybe further engagement past that. And so it's more public, and then there's this like threaded nature of them that more people may be tagging on to a response to a question. So Celine, does that help? We're definitely going to show it too in a moment, and if it were helpful, we could do it now, but we're definitely going to look at what it looks like in Canvas. But Celine, does that help at least clarify for right now?
Celine's doing the great thing where she just clicked yes in the participants list.
Oh, look at that. Thank you very much.
Nice, Celine.
We're all learning together. None of us asked for this, it turns out. But here we are. All right, thank you. I'll be quiet now.
All right, so moving on. Again, we'll come back to this point again and again, to the point where you might get tired of hearing it, but determining your purpose in assigning discussion boards is the necessary first step. Thinking about what you're really after, what you want to achieve, why you assign this and not some other kind of more private kind of assignment or private journal, that really matters. And so use that to guide all of the rest of your decisions, from setting up the board all the way through to giving feedback to individual students. All right, so I know we just had a question about what is a discussion board, but are there any other questions before we move on? Like I said, we're going to be pausing for these Q&As regularly, so feel free to interject at these moments. Alana.
Yeah, so my question, I'm just getting a little bit confused between platforms and what one uses with one versus another, or entirely separately. So the discussion boards are for Canvas, quite apart from any kind of Zoom lecture meeting, correct? They don't have, it doesn't happen simultaneously with that.
That's correct. So anything that happens in Zoom when you're engaging with students happens in real time. They're there, they're talking to you, you have a question response right there. In Canvas, it's not real time.
Okay. Yeah, I just, sorry, I know that was kind of obvious, but I just needed to clarify it for myself. Thank you.
No, that's perfect. Thank you for the question.
Any other questions before we move on? About discussion boards, about purposes? Okay.
So now we're going to switch gears just a little bit and show you a little bit more about what these things look like in Canvas. So what you're seeing here is what happens when you click on discussions in your course menu. So you will start off with this page that has kind of the strange image in the middle, and then you've got some additional options over on the right. What you'll see in the middle eventually will be a listing of all of the discussions in your class. So all of those opportunities for students to interact with each other, you will see them listed here. But in the beginning, what you'll want to do, and actually let me take one step back, because you will have multiple discussions in your listing, you'll also want to make sure that you are pinning your discussions as well, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Pinning discussions just to make sure that it kind of gets the students right up front and lets them see the things that you want them to be working on at the moment. But of course, the first step is actually creating one of these things. So to do that, you start by clicking the plus discussion in the upper right corner. And when you click that, you get a new page that pops up. And these are the kinds of things that you'll see on the page. So I'm going to talk through each one of these individual sections of this particular discussion creation, but I will tell you that there's excellent documentation in the Canvas community, and this slide deck does have the link to that, and we'll provide that for you guys as well. So starting at the top, you want to give your discussion a topic. So this is basically a one-line title for the conversation, right? This is what will show up in the listing, and it kind of sets the context for what you're doing with this particular discussion board. Then you've got room to put a prompt and instructions. And you can see you can do all kinds of fancy formatting. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But this is effectively where you want to set the stage for this discussion conversation. So maybe provide them with a little bit of information about the purpose that you've got for this conversation. I'm going to pop back down to the attachment section. So in the attachment, you can upload a file that is specific just to this discussion. So you could, for example, if you want the students to be analyzing a paper and providing some insights on that paper, You could upload a PDF of that research paper right directly in the discussion, and it will show up kind of encased with this conversation. There are a number of ways that you can configure what the student experience looks like in Canvas, and we'll talk about each of these in a minute. There are some key ones that you'll pay attention to, and you'll get kind of in a routine once you start building these discussion boards more to know your preferences and to know which one of these you want to select at any particular time. You do have the option to make a discussion just for individual groups in your course. So let me give a little bit of context on this, and then we'll talk more about it later. If you find yourself teaching remote to a group of 100 or 300 students, that can be a really big group of people to be in a single conversation at the same time. So what you can do in Canvas is you can take that big group of students and chop it up into smaller groups of students so that maybe there are 5 people discussing the topics instead of 300. And that can help to take a big class and make it a little bit more intimate. It can help connect the students to each other and to the course, and it can help to keep them engaged because it's a little bit more personal and a little bit more intriguing for the students. The other thing that you can do is you can say exactly when this discussion board is open for participation. So maybe you want to set it up so that you encourage students to not be working on your discussion boards over the weekend. So you have it available from a Monday to a Friday. Maybe you want to set up the opposite. Maybe you want to say, I want to have this open from a Wednesday to a Tuesday, but then after that week, I don't want students engaging with this material anymore. So you can set up those deadlines directly in the discussion. The final thing you see here is the options for what to do with these drafts once you've got them created. The key thing to remember whenever you're in Canvas, if you click just save, that means that it's basically a draft that is available only to you. If you click save and publish, that means that you're ready for other students to participate, to see or to participate in what you've put up there in Canvas as well. So you'll always have that option whenever you're creating anything new in Canvas. So let's dig just a little bit further into those options that we can see. So I'm going to go again through each one of these pretty much individually just to kind of talk through what they mean. The first is allow threaded replies. So in the language of Canvas, what this means is let students respond and that you respond to other students. So the default is that this is not checked. I almost always, when I create discussions, the first thing I do is come in here and check that, because my whole purpose of a discussion is to engage the students in conversation. So that's just one of those things that I pretty much always check off every time I create a new discussion. Second one is a little more interesting. So perhaps part of your purpose in the discussion is to encourage students to have original thoughts and then to see how those thoughts connect with the original thoughts of other students in the class. So what you can do, if you click the checkbox next to users must post before seeing replies, from the student perspective, when they go and open the discussion board, they will see the prompt and they will see an option to reply. And they can go ahead and click reply. They can think about the prompt and what you're asking them to conceptualize and write about. They can put in their response, and then they click post. The minute that they click post, they can see their response and the response of all the other students as well. So it gives them some space to kind of conceptualize and think about what they want to write before they compare what they're thinking and what they want to write with what the other students have done. So that can be a very helpful tool. Mm-hmm. If you're going to be giving the students points for participating, you want to be sure that you click off the graded, and we'll talk more about that in a second as well. Allow liking. So I will start by saying use this with caution. What you don't want to set up in your course is kind of a social media feel where students are liking and unliking and setting up some less than ideal interactions with each other. However, one use case that you might find it helpful to have liking is if you are, for example, asking students, what questions do you have about this week's lecture? Some of the students might have the same question, right? So they might conceptually have gone through the material and say, I don't understand this concept at all. Instead of having all the students post that same question 10, 15, 20 times, you can allow liking and tell the students, check the other posts to see if someone else has the same question. And if they have, let me know by liking that question. And that basically lets you manage the sometimes unwieldy length of discussions and responses. You will see a count of who has liked a particular post, so that will give you more information on the instructor side. And finally, you've got this option to add to the student to do. And this just effectively gives the students something on their calendar and on their coming up that is time and date stamped, that lets them know that you're looking for something to be done or engaged with at the time. We'll talk more about this when we get a little bit more into the pedagogy, but I just wanted to highlight that here. All right, so we talked a little bit about taking that big class discussion and making it smaller groups. And one of the options in our Canvas discussion said, this is a group discussion. So let's see what this actually looks like. So when you click the this is a group discussion, now you have an option to set up a group set. And if you click new group category, now you've got some additional options that appear. So the new group category basically creates a group set where you can give it a name, and you can identify how the students will associate themselves with individual groups. So over on the right-hand side here, I've got the Allow Self-Sign-Up checked off. You can see you get some additional options there. So you can say you want to create 10 groups, and no more than 5 students can be in each group. So that's a way to kind of just randomly craft, or excuse me, to randomly set up these sets of students that they can go and organize themselves into. You also have the option to let Canvas do some random generation. So you can say just split the students into a specific number of groups, basically, and do it manually. Or you can go and literally click and drag students into the specific groups that you want them to be in. So in other words, there are options. As you're thinking about what you want the interaction to look like and what your purpose of the board is, that might inform some of the choices that you make on how you set up those smaller group discussions. And again, as we mentioned earlier, there is additional documentation in the Canvas documentation, and we've included a link here so you can go back and dig into all the gory details of how to set these things up in Canvas. One note, when you do set up a group discussion, what happens is the individual prompt that you have written will be copied into each group space. And when you go to the discussion, you'll see this type of a listing at the top. You click on any one of these links to go into that individual group's copy of the discussion prompt and see how the students are interacting. So just to kind of give you a heads up that what happens on this side from the student perspective is they go to the discussion and they just see their small group discussion. When you go to the discussion, you can access all of those smaller group discussions. Hopefully that makes sense.
Karen, maybe there is one question in the chat that maybe we could just address really quickly. Alana was wondering, why would you use the self sign up?
Yeah, so it will very much depend on the interaction that you're looking for in your course. So maybe in some cases you want the students to get into a group that they follow the entire term. And maybe you know that the course has a lot of juniors and seniors in it. They have other students that they know about that they are already enrolled in the course, so they're kind of almost coming together as a cohort. If you allow students to sign up themselves, they can say, hey, Erica, I know you from my previous class. Let's get together in this discussion so we can know who we're chatting with the entire term. So it's a way to let students kind of connect with students that they already know.
And can students be in multiple groups at once in Canvas? So can you manually assign them to a discussion section and then also have students self-select into their own voluntary study groups, for example?
So each discussion can be, each student can be in only one discussion group. but each discussion can have different group sets.
Could you explain the difference?
Yeah. So every discussion in Canvas is going to be connected to one organization of students. But that organization of students does not have to be in place for the entire term. So you could say, this is our discussion for week 1. By the time we get to week 3, you guys can reorganize yourselves and get into new groups in week 3. So it lets you change up potentially how the students have organized themselves. One other quick comment that's a little bit of a lesson learned. It can be awkward in a remote environment to have self-sign up, because if you don't know the other students in the class, it can be really challenging to suddenly know that you have to find your person that you're going to be talking with for the entire term. There are some strategies that you can use in those situations. The first, in a very meta way, you can set up a discussion that is an organize yourselves discussion. And maybe you say, what are your interests? And then students can find students with similar interests, right? And that's one way that can inform them getting together into groups. Another strategy that can work really well also is to say, you have until Friday of week 1 to organize yourself. If you have not organized yourself into a group on Friday, I'm going to randomly assign you to a group. So for those students who don't necessarily want to reach out on that discussion, who don't necessarily want to find somebody else, they just want to know, who do I have to talk with? I will make this work. That gives them an option to not have to go and kind of introduce themselves or connect with people, but still get in a smaller group. Really long answer to a short question, but does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to kind of jump through this pretty quickly because some of these things we have talked about a little bit prior. The first is that first button is key. The whole point of discussions is to engage in conversation, so please, please, please make sure that you are purposeful about how you handle that first button. I'm also going to talk a little bit about staggering deadlines. So one of the key things that instructors tend to do when we're thinking pedagogically is we say, post your own response and then respond to 2 other students. Out of the box, Canvas does not have the ability to have more than one deadline on a discussion. So what you want to do is you want to set both a deadline on the discussion, make it graded, set a deadline, and you want to add it to the students to do, because that will let you have 2 different dates on a discussion. And what it effectively does is you have that first date, and you say, please post your first post by Wednesday. And that is something that shows up on the calendar. And then you say, and respond to 2 other people by Friday. And that's what the due date is. And we can talk more about that as we get going as well. I'm going to go ahead and move on, if that's okay. Right. So this one I'm going to jump through really quickly because it's pretty straightforward. Basically what you want to do is you want to, if you want to give students points for participating, you want to be sure that you check the graded option on your discussion session settings, and then you want to identify how many points, what the grade is displayed as. An assignment group is kind of a nitty-gritty detail, but if you have weighted sets of assignments in your course, that's how you would use that. And the key thing here is the deadlines, and that will be down at the bottom of the page, and that just basically lets the students know by when you want them to be finished with the discussion interaction. So that would be the due date. And again, there's a ton of information in the Canvas community. If you want more, either reach out to one of us or take a look at what Canvas says. One additional note, so once you've created a graded discussion, you and the students will see a new banner that appears at the top of the discussion. And it just gives them an indication that this is for realsies now, you're getting points for it. And it tells them how many points they'll get. And notice also when you click on the what I call the kebab menu, the 3 dots in a row over on the right hand side, you have some additional options here for things like Speed Grader, which is where you'll go in and give students feedback and look at what they've submitted. And importantly, add a rubric. And again, we'll talk a ton about this later. Rubrics are effectively in Canvas, it looks kind of like a table. There are some key things to be aware of with your rubrics. Again, you want to tailor the rubric to your intended purpose. So if you're looking for that attendance, you probably don't want a 10 criteria with 5 different ratings in each one of those things, right? It's a little bit simpler if you're just doing attendance. And that's kind of an extreme, but that gives you kind of a feel for what we're talking about there. Know that you can absolutely reuse these. So once you've created one and it fits your purposes, instead of recreating it every time, you can use that button on the right that says Find Rubric and just use that. Make it straightforward for yourself. One of the key and super important settings that will save you time and consternation is that use this rubric for assignment grading. If you don't click that, Canvas assumes that the rubric is only for informational purposes, and it won't take the score that is generated from this rubric and put it in your gradebook. So you definitely want to be sure, if you're using grading on your discussions, that you click that Use this rubric for assignment grading.
And just a quick follow on that, if you wanted to have assignments that were more formative, so what gets entered in the gradebook is participation, but you give them feedback via the rubric so that they can get a sense of how they're doing, then you wouldn't necessarily need to say use this rubric for assignment grading. They'd still be able to see how they're doing relative to the criteria that you set up. And criteria might be like clarity, depth of the course material, or depth of using of course material, relevance of course material to argument, etc. So you could still have students getting feedback through a rubric. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily getting graded. Their grade, that would be more of a formative assessment than a summative assessment.
All right.
So I know we have a couple of questions lingering in the chat, so let's get to them.
Yeah. I wanted to start with Christina, who had a question about group discussions, and then Alana had another useful, pragmatic question.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, thank you for this. I have a question about group discussions when you have group sets set up for sections. So I'm teaching ginormous courses, and you can break those courses up into group sets based upon the TA, and every TA then essentially has kind of like their own site.
Yep.
And then when you go into the discussions there, each TA still has 30 students, so we want to limit the discussions on that group set to smaller groups. But when we try to limit it to smaller groups, it once again shows the entire class list. Mm-hmm. So, or because there's already predetermined group sets, the only option is to choose the other predetermined group sets. So I'm wondering if there's a workaround to create smaller groups for group discussion when you already have group sets.
Smaller groups.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the answer to that is to create a separate group set for your super small set groups.
Okay.
So you'd have then one group set that is basically for your discussion sessions, right, with your TAs or Is, and then you have a separate group set that is the actual small student groups, so 5 to 8 person.
Okay, and then how do you when students are in a group set for their sections and they enter into Canvas, they can go to their section group set. They can also go to their discussion group set. So that would mean that they have essentially 3 different Canvas sites that they're going to now.
Yeah, so each of your group spaces are under the umbrella of your course space.
Right.
So sometimes for the students, it's not super clear that they're in kind of a smaller group set, although they will see the group name in the upper left corner. But yes, in this case, they would have your full Canvas course with everybody in it,
Mm-hmm.
a group for their TAs or IAs, and then a group for their small groups. And the trick there is you just want to be super clear about what you name the group sets. So at that point, calling them like group set 1 is probably not helpful, but maybe calling them discussion session with and your TA's name, right?
And will students see only the group sets that they're in, or will they see all of, okay. Good.
Yeah, so if they go to people, they will have the ability to see all of the group sets. And if self-organization is turned on, they will be able to see all the individual groups and click join. But once they have joined one, and a little group icon will show up on the far left menu for themselves, right? Like under their calendar and inbox in that area, and that will only show them the groups that they're a part of.
Okay, thank you.
Karen, could I quickly clarify some terminologies for some folks? Is there a difference between a group and a group set?
Yes, so a group set is a combination of groups.
Got it. So
A group is a combination of students.
got it.
It's really hard to not use group there. A group is a group of groups. Yeah.
And a group is a group of students. Sounds good.
Dr. Seuss would be proud of us.
So, Lauren, you had a question as well? Ooh, Alana?
So
Sorry, I had to unmute and I was on the Canvas page. My question was, and you might have already mentioned this, and I apologize if you have, but when the students are given the option to sign up for their own groups, how do they know, where do they go to know who is in the class?
yes, so that's where potentially having a discussion where students can introduce themselves and start to find like-minded students will come in handy. Students can go to people and they will see the names of the other students in the class.
Sorry, can you just point out where that is?
Where the roster is?
Yes, for the students.
So they also have access to people.
Oh, they do. Okay, all right.
They don't see the same information that you do. So you see the name, what section they're in, a little bit of information about the person. They will only see the names.
Okay. Do they see email?
They do not.
They do not. Just the names. Okay.
Just the names, yeah.
But they can send messages to each other through Canvas?
They can. So if they go through the inbox, they can send a message either to a specific student or to a group that they're in. And it will send a message to all students in that group.
Oh, that's great. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
It helps.
Great. Any other questions before we move on? No. All right, sounds good. Okay, so now we want to talk a little bit about ways to create some engaging asynchronous discussion boards. So we'll talk a little bit about guidelines for questions or kinds of questions you can ask in the prompts, kinds of responses you might prompt students to give, and then thinking a little carefully about your role in the discussion, because it is really easy to sort of set it and forget it and say, like, I have the discussion, they have the deadlines, I'll go back in when it's over. But we want to encourage you to be minding the boards while they're happening as well. So we'll talk about each of these. So when writing questions in these prompts, again, always, I tried to warn you, consider your purpose. Is the question that you're writing aligned with the thing that you're really after? And that might mean that you have different purposes for different boards. That's good and great, but make sure the questions you're asking in those different boards align with the purposes you're after. Ensure that whatever question you ask is going to be relevant at the time when the students encounter it. So especially if you're setting up a lot of these discussion boards now for later future use, ask yourself, will the students have everything they need to answer this question in the way that I expect them to answer it? And so try to make sure your questions are relevant. Think ahead to how your question might prompt certain kinds of responses. So especially if the question is pretty open-ended or it has lots of possible interpretations, that means that lots of possible responses are probable. And is that okay? Is that something you're looking for? Questions that are a little bit more straightforward, and I mean, this is a matter of philosophical debate whether or not summarize is a straightforward question. But if you say summarize the reading, you're going to get lots of the same responses over and over and over and over. So think ahead to the kinds of responses that students will instinctively latch onto in this question, and also the kind of interaction the question might generate. So with a question like summarize, think ahead to how students might reply to a summary of a reading. Like, I agree, great, good job. So will it generate superficial thumbs up? Will it generate some critique, some debate? Is that okay? So think ahead to not just how students will respond, but how students will respond to each other in the discussion board when you're thinking about these questions. So we have the next few slides are like different kinds of questions that you can ask. And if we have time, we can talk through the relative pros and cons, plus and minus of any of these approaches. But I'm just going to quickly go through these because I think they're pretty straightforward. So one type of question that we're probably all used to is asking recurring questions. So core sets of questions that you would just repeat throughout the course. So you would set up maybe 5 or 6 boards, and everyone's expected to do all the boards, and you ask the same question in each board, or roughly the same sets of questions. So that would be something like summarize the readings from this week and connect at least one reading from this week to something we've previously discussed. Identify and explain the main argument and reflect on the degree to which you are convinced or not convinced, right? So these are questions that you could theoretically offer at any point in the course. They will always be relevant. The students will theoretically always have what they need to answer this question because they're all about this week's readings, if they're doing reading, of course. But as you might imagine, this will create certain kinds of responses over time. So the next set of questions that you might consider is setting up boards that are organized by themes, and asking students to interact with at least, with each theme a certain number of times per quarter. So here's 3 potential boards that you can set up, and they could have different kinds of deadlines and due dates. You could have a reading responses discussion boards where students highlight something from the reading they find interesting, surprising, confusing, and explain why. You could have a personal reflection board where they draw a connection between the course concept or a reading to something in their experiences. You could also then have an application board where they connect something to the outside world, the quote unquote real world. So yeah, Matt, you had a thing you wanted to say about the thematic boards?
Oh, just a real quick pitch. It's a way of creating variety, but making the variety predictable. And so that's the only thing. So it's a way of handling it for yourself, but also giving students just different ways to engage with course material. So I've found a lot of success with it in the past. So that's all.
Yeah, and I think the important point with theme boards, similar to recurring questions, is the students will always have what they need to complete, to give appropriate responses to these boards. Because they are sort of meta, they're about things that they're not tied to a particular concept or to a particular reading. They'll all be able to pop in at any time to any of these discussions and answer the prompts. You could decide that they need to do one of each of these by week 4 and then another one of each of these by week 9 or something like that. But they are in more control to answer those boards by those deadlines. And finally, probably something that we're all somewhat familiar with if we're asking exam questions and things like that is to create new discussion board questions that change as the course content changes. There's some benefits to this in the sense that it creates even more variety for the students, especially if you ask specific open-ended questions that could have many, many different answers and interpretations. So I put 3 examples here that I've used in my own classes before when I've taught about social inequality. So these are really, really specific questions about Marx versus Bourdieu and feminist theory. And also, I think this first question was from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book. And so they're really specific. They're really tied to whatever the students are supposed to be engaging with that week. The downside of this, of course, is that you have to come up with questions all the time. But there's some real benefit to this because they generate really interesting discussions if they're open-ended and open to lots of potential interpretations. So we just went over some question types. We went through them really quickly. Does anyone have questions about the questions or thoughts, like interests in any of the question types we just reviewed? Reactions? Yeah, Christina?
Okay, I'm going to turn on my video. Okay, so when I was a graduate student, I TA'd in a class where discussion was, well, discussion board based. And one of my concerns is now that I'm from the humanities program, for those that don't know me. Now that we have so many TAs, I feel like it's my responsibility to provide them with professional development opportunities. And my concern with TAs and discussion boards is, pretty much all that relegates them to the position of graders. Like, all they're doing is just reading and using rubrics or whatever it is that the instructor has set out to just grade the post. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on how to incorporate TAs into the discussion board making process, or how to use discussion boards to provide kind of a more diverse professional experience for the TAs.
That's a great question. I know we'll talk a little bit about how instructors have a role to play in the discussions, and I think in the next slide, and I think that's where TAs really come in. So if you think about, so I have two thoughts. One is about their role in the discussion, and one is about their role in setting up the discussion. So let me first talk about the first one in facilitating. If we think about discussion boards as different, of course, because they're asynchronous, but if you think about what happens in a discussion section, what the role of a TA is in a discussion section, most of the time in TA prep, or when I would prep for a section, it would always be like, okay, I need to come up with like maybe 10 minutes of me talking through and clarifying things, but most of the rest of the time is me setting up some kind of way to scaffold a discussion towards some understanding. And so if the idea is the board is the scaffolding, this TA's role is still to help pull students along, to help them see what's relevant and interesting and build on these discussion boards. So you can set up your discussion board posts that the TAs themselves can comment, not just comment on individual posts and assign grades, but also like offer interesting perspectives or extend certain folks' posts. TAs can be involved in the reply process, so they are not only replying to the post or the board itself, but they're also then in those threads talking with individuals, like small groups of students in those threads. So there's that. So I see you raise, I see you raised your hand.
Oh, my hand is still raised.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't lower it. Yeah, I would say that like when I was TAing in such an environment, I felt that by responding to the discussion board, it was almost like I was working all the time, right? So during a particular discussion section where I would be interacting with the students. So I think that that I was definitely guilty of mismanaging my time when I was TAing with the discussion board. And then the other issue is that I found that after I would comment on student posts or insert myself into the thread, because most students just post like 5 minutes before it's due, I was wasting my time and nobody was actually reading anything that I was saying.
Interesting.
Yeah, Christina, this like super resonates with me, both the concern for the TA's professional development and the experience of like interacting with discussion boards. We are going to talk a little bit about sort of the grading or the responding, and that might address some of this. I think there's also this kind of alchemy to good discussion boards, and I don't know what the magic formula is, so if you can report back, that'd be really interesting. I think you're already thinking about this, though, in the best way, which is how can I involve the TAs? So
Yes.
Maybe in that alchemy question, letting them experiment and come back and report what they've tried and what worked or what they found would be a really interesting thing. And just pragmatically, and I'm sure you're already thinking this, but pragmatically, you can also ask them to be, if you're doing the like generating discussion boards that are tied to content, which I think is probably really appropriate for y'all, right? It's basically getting students to sort of mini practice engagements with the readings that they'll be doing in the papers, right? You could be maybe 2 weeks out asking the TAs, right? Hey, and you could do this in the discussion board, right? If you're running their seminar through Canvas, right? Everybody post a potential discussion board question for us to use 2 weeks from now for students. And then they can just like pop likes on and basically crowdsource which ones are going to be the best, or it'll trigger potentially interesting discussions. So just a couple thoughts real quick, but I really appreciate the question.
Right. So having a discussion board for the TAs essentially.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it'd be a way, that doesn't have to become this whole huge thing, right, where people are interacting and it's a conversation, but it can be a place. That's a really good example of where an asynchronous discussion would work well. 2 weeks from now, we're going to be reading this stuff. Everybody post one question that we might use as the discussion board question in Canvas for the course, right? That's a really good place where it's contained. It's a place where it has value, that it's public, so people see the other questions that people are posting, rather than them all emailing them to you. Do you know what I'm saying? So yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, I think there'd be something to that.
I think another potential approach here as well is to have your teacher TAs how to use the discussion boards to find trends and use some of the analytics that you can get through Canvas to kind of figure out what students are talking about, and use that to have your TAs actually create some just-in-time instruction. So maybe they see the same questions that come up every once in a while, or maybe they're seeing that the questions illustrate that they don't understand a specific concept, and giving your TAs the opportunity to actually craft a little mini instructional module on that particular topic, and that kind of gets them some experience with instruction as well.
Will you talk about how to track trends?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
And there's a question from Cindy in here about, do TAs and instructors have automatic access to contribute to any particular discussion? Do instructors have to give TAs access to contribute?
The TA access is automatic. And if you've used the group discussion feature, you can also dip into every group discussion as an instructor or a TA. So you have full access to every conversation that's happening.
All right. So moving on. Oh wait, Alana, quick question.
Yeah, you've talked a lot about TAs, and we've been talking about labor. So for those of us who have relatively small classes but have no TAs, how does one actually limit how much time one spends doing this, assuming the students are being responsive, and they'll have to by virtue of you making all these requirements for their participation? It seems like there's no end how you could engage between Zoom and Canvas.
I think we have good news for you, which is that we have some thoughts about that coming, and
Okay.
And good meta news for you again, which is that you're asking the right question. I think the fact that you're asking that question means you're going to be tracking your energy and your participation, your time in the right way, and this again might fall into the experiment, see what works, and then revise from there. And we talked about this in other webinars of just let students know you're going to be experimenting, so that they can expect that, because you're all in this adventure together. But in terms of the pragmatics of sort of managing your time and different options for interacting with the discussion boards, that's where we're headed.
Okay. I just wanted to say, no, you're absolutely wrong. I will have the tendency to spend way too much time. I'm one of those people who gives way too much feedback on writing assignments too. So that's why I'm asking the question, because I'm nervous about how I will interact with this. So thank you. I'll mute myself now, though.
That's a great thing to realize about yourself, and that's why a lot of and I know you were in the webinar yesterday where I think it was yesterday. What is time anymore? It doesn't matter. It's all one big Zoom meeting, but it's a big focus of ours, this limiting and prioritizing feedback on student writing. That goes maybe double for discussion board posts, and it really comes back to the question of what is the purpose of the discussion board, and then that dictates what level of commenting you're doing or what level of feedback you're offering. And again, we're going to go through some options for that. But Elena, if you're really thinking about this question of I give too much feedback and I know that, and how do I do something differently, that's a place where you could just reach out. These are one of the kinds of conversations that we have with faculty in the Writing Hub, is talking to them about their feedback practices and helping you learn how to spend your time and your energy the way that serves both you and your students the best. So feel free to send me or to send us an email, just writinghub@ucsd.edu, and we'll be happy to chat with you about that if and when you have time to think about that, right? Which may be a year from now, and that's totally cool. So
yeah, I think it was about certainly almost a year ago that you made that initial invitation. So that's about a realistic time frame. But yes, I will. Thank you.
That a year from now is the time frame we should be living on. So that's great. Let's do that.
Okay. So in terms of facilitating responses, just generally help students, and this helps you as well, because the more the students are able to give you the thing that you're after, the more explicit you are, the easier it will be for you, hopefully, theoretically, in giving feedback for these things. And we'll talk a little bit more, Alana, about different kinds of feedback practices and options. So be explicit in how students should respond to the prompts. Build that into when you're building up the discussion board, actually say, here's what I'm expecting. What kind of reference to course material are you looking for? How deep should they be going into it? Do they need to be citing material or not? Does it not matter? And so what your expectations are for responses not only depends on your purpose, but also depends on the extent to which you think these activities build into and support or supplement the other activities you're doing in class. And so let your understanding of how the discussion board fits into all the other course activities and assignments guide you here. And similarly, you want to help students understand the ways they should be reacting and responding to each other. Lots of times we'll say something like, here's what I'm expecting in your original response, and then respond to other students. Okay, respond is a pretty vague word. What does that mean? So think about how you could use other kinds of verbs in talking and giving directions, and here's what your response looks like, and here's what your reply looks like. So you could have students compare and contrast their responses with their own response, pick a person or pick a peer's response, and then extend that with more argument or more evidence. Connect to responses or ask two peers questions and then have folks answer those questions. So there's lots of potential ways to have students reply that is more specific than just respond.
All right, so you can also set up discussion boards that are more than just texts, and they solicit more information from students than just a written response. So for example, you could prompt students to interact with things such as images and descriptions or videos or PowerPoints. In other words, we're in the web environment now, so let's leverage some of the power and the promise of the web environment, right? So you can start to kind of bring in a variety of different modalities for students to process the topics that you're talking about and actually craft a response to those. And Canvas gives you all kinds of information. Again, you will get these slides after the fact. Each of these underlined titles here are actually links to help documentation specifically designed for students. So it tells them how to add a YouTube video, how to record their own video content. So it really is a nice community for engaging with the students and letting them bring in things that are more than text on some of these discussions. Just for the purposes of today, let's kind of focus a little bit in on images and descriptions. So what might this look like? So I'm going to give you a second to read through this.
And for context, OP means original post, original poster.
All right, so you can see here, we're very much asking the students to go find a piece of media, do an analysis on that media, present that to the rest of the class. So we really are asking them to move beyond just text and to bring something else in. So here's some additional information for you about what these might look like. So here's an example, and this is actually from a real student assignment. So you can see the image that was uploaded into a discussion. So you can see that in itself could prompt a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion, because it's intriguing. It draws you in and it kind of makes you want to engage with this material. From the student's perspective, when they're responding to a discussion, they will get the menu that appears kind of down here in this lower left corner. So you can see one of the icons looks like a picture of mountains. And if you hover over that, it tells you embed image. So the thing that pops up after you've clicked that is this insert and edit image. So students can upload their own image if they want to. They can include an image that they found out on another website somewhere. But one of the kind of cool features for students just getting used to Canvas is they can actually search Flickr for Creative Commons licensed images. So that's interesting because sometimes it helps them make connections between the concepts and the visuals. So you can see here, I just did a search on the word culture and showed kind of the first set of images that appear. Maybe some of those are intriguing and they prompt students to say, oh, this is really interesting. This is how this connects to the concepts in the course. So it just kind of gives them an option to find things on that vast wild west of the World Wide Web. All right, so I think as we alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I think it's really important to think about your role when you're thinking about a discussion. So you've heard this a million times from us, but consider kind of the purpose, right? In some regards, what you're looking for is to let students talk amongst themselves. In which case, it's actually better if you kind of hang back a little bit and not respond to every post, but let students respond to each other. One of the keys with that is to know that that's happening and kind of keep a watchful eye over that, because you want to make sure that you're making sure that the community guidelines are being enforced. If there's any ways that the conversation starts to kind of take a left-hand turn and they should be turning right, you can kind of help to re-guide them back to where you want them to be. But it really is a matter at that point of just not responding, just reading, so that you're kind of keeping up with what's happening on the board. A really good practice in the discussions throughout your class is you yourself want to make sure that you're not necessarily responding to the same student every time. So maybe keep track of who you're responding to. Could be in like a Google document, or you could use the notes column in your grade book. Find some way to make sure that over the course of the term, you don't find yourself drawn to that one student who posts those eye-grabbing images every time, right? You're also responding to that student who maybe would be an introvert if you had them in your face-to-face class and not necessarily participate fully in the discussion, but they have really interesting insights. And always purposefully plan at the beginning of the term to interact with all of the students in your class. Also, particularly in the spring quarter, we are in a unique situation. Who in their wildest imagination would have guessed that we would be holding a webinar on asynchronous discussions because we're teaching remote in the spring quarter of 2020, right? None of us would. We're in unprecedented and unexpected times. So just know that as an instructor, it is really important that you are aware of that and you kind of watch for potential signs of either distress or things where you should maybe intervene, connect with the student maybe individually, touch base with them just to make sure that things are moving along. It is also super important for you to know that it's not necessarily your responsibility to dig in and handle all of these problems. There are resources available on campus and resources available online through campus that you can direct students to. So be aware of those and have that as kind of in your back pocket if you need them. A super, super key thing as well, Canvas likes to send notifications. So it will ping you when somebody posts on a discussion board every time sometimes. Be aware that you have some agency in that, and you can tell Canvas when and how you want to be notified. So maybe you don't want that text message at 2 o'clock in the morning when a student did a thumbs up or I agree on another student's post, right? Maybe you can go in and set your personal preferences so that in general the notifications are set across all courses, and be aware that every time you post something on a discussion, Canvas tries to be helpful and subscribes you to notifications. So just be aware of that and turn those off, because you don't necessarily want to find yourself in a position where you're feeling like you have to respond to everything in 5 minutes or less and you have to fully be online. You do have the right and almost the responsibility to kind of know what you're taking on and how you're managing that, and you are not required to be super involved and super heavy-handed in every single discussion. With that, we will.
Yeah, I know we have a couple of questions. Christina, you had a question about having students record to My Media.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay, so there are a couple responses to that. So the students will have access to their My Media, and that will upload a video into their little section of My Media. One of the challenges with that is then they have to be purposeful about getting it from My Media into a discussion in Canvas. So an alternative option that you might consider, instead of My Media, you can actually use the media icon in the discussion response toolbar to record and upload a video there. And what happens when they do that is they'll get a little window that pops up, and it'll have a big record button in the middle, and they'll say record, and the Canvas will actually tunnel in through the camera on their computer, keep track of what they're saying, and record audio and video, and then they'll click stop, and it will actually embed it directly into the discussion. So it's a really nice feature, a quick and easy way for students to not have to have anything else and not really need a bunch of instructions about how to connect videos from My Media into the discussion. It's just right fully in the discussion.
They can also save a video locally on their computer and upload it as a file into the discussion as well.
Yeah. The other question about, since we're on My Media and Media Gallery, I know you record on My Media and then you upload it to Media Gallery for the class. Is Media Gallery display all the videos for the class?
It displays everything that you've published to that gallery.
So would that include all the professors, all of the TAs, everything?
Yeah, so it's not everything in their My Media. So that's the difference between the two. You will have a ton more in My Media than you do in your Media Gallery. The Media Gallery is only things that are available to everybody in the class.
Okay.
But Christina, if I hear what you're saying correctly, it might be a conversation about naming conventions, right? To among the instructors, among the TAs, to really just sort of like, there's going to be a ton of content that we're managing. We really need to think about how we're doing it. But maybe I'm mishearing you. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. So I have one professor that I'm working with. He's uploading all of his videos to all of his lectures to the Media Gallery. So I think I should advise then the TAs, if they're going to do any sort of videos, that they should be using a different type of tool. Otherwise, all the TAs' videos are going to be with the instructors, right? Yeah. Everything.
Yes. The other option is to go ahead and put it in the Media Gallery and then create a separate page in Canvas that embeds all of the curated videos in it. Because then you can say, like, these are the instructors' videos and these are the TAs' videos.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Alana?
Hi. I don't know if this. I really love the idea of the discussion board that allows them to upload images and media clips and that sort of thing. But I'm still unsure as to what the mechanics of setting that up is. Was that in the slide? Can I just go back to the slide afterwards, and will that show me how to get there in discussion?
Yes, and the good news is you don't have to do anything special to enable students to have that capability. They have that capability already. What you want to do is you want to craft the prompt of your discussion so that it encourages students to utilize the capability that already exists.
Yeah, so there's no special box to click or anything. All you have to do is write a question that says, find a media, find a piece of media, find a video, find a GIF, whatever.
And they'll know how to do that.
So that's where the link to the instructions on the slide comes in handy.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So
good. All right. I just wanted to know that I could go back to that. Thank you.
For sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so moving on. I know it's about 2:15, so we're going to try to get you out of here early, or not early, but on time. So the last part of the webinar, and we might go through this pretty quickly, is thinking about how to give feedback. And I know it's already been addressed that, like, we don't want to be working all the time, responding to every single post. We're going to give you a couple of different models and show you how to set it up in Canvas. So again, as always, match your feedback to your purpose. So these different kinds of purposes would result in different kind of feedback options. If you're doing asynchronous attendance, it makes sense to give students complete, not complete on these discussion board posts. If you're wanting to motivate student engagement, you might need a more robust rubric that you generate, that you give to students, that maybe is or isn't graded. If you're thinking that writing in the discussion board is going to help prepare students for their writing assignments for later papers, then you might need to think about how your feedback will push them to have deeper analysis or better analysis of course material in their writing projects later on. So here are some different models of feedback. They go from less time intensive to more time intensive. So the least time intensive is complete, incomplete. The next set is to give them some variation, and we've all seen this, of like needs improvement, satisfactory, great, or minus, check, plus, or whatever. You can have that as your grading model, so you can set up in your rubric satisfactory, needs improvement, or great. And then you can determine if you also want to give feedback on those posts. So you could just give minus, check, plus, and no feedback. You could give minus, check, plus, and then give feedback to some individual students throughout the quarter, but not all of them if you have a really large class. Just as we said, make sure you're spreading out that feedback and responding to lots of different students, not just the same students over and over. Or you could give really light feedback to each student, maybe one sentence of, here's where I think it could be different or better or interesting or whatever. One sentence light feedback is an option. You can also set up a more, as I said, a dense or robust rubric and let that rubric be your feedback and not provide any written feedback at all. You could provide, again, some individual feedback to some students throughout the quarter, but not every single student on every single post throughout the quarter. Or again, light feedback, one sentence per student, maybe 2 sentences max that help contextualize what's your scoring in the rubric. And then the most time intensive would be the way we're used to grading writing assignments, which would be to have a rubric and then also to give more substantive feedback. But the reason why we include this spectrum of options is all of these can be appealing to you, and that's fine. One of these isn't more lazy or more better than the other. These are all valid ways to give feedback as long as your feedback matches your purpose and matches your understanding of the pedagogical value of the discussion board for the students' learning. And so any of these are good and fine, and you can take advantage of them. So think about which one of these is appealing to you. In the interest of time, we'll skip the next couple of slides. With more time, we'd put you in breakout groups, but we can talk more about the slides later. So Karen, perfect. So make your scoring criteria and feedback approach explicit to the students. That link there in the slide is how they access the rubric, how they can see the rubric in Canvas. But don't just make the approach explicit, make your motivation for that approach explicit. Students appreciate when they recognize that all of your decisions are really intentional. Consider how scoring will reinforce other activities. So if you don't need substantive feedback in these posts for these discussion board posts because that feedback is not going to enable their success in writing assignments or exams, then give them a pass, no pass, or give them that minus, check, plus, and maybe some light feedback to encourage them to keep going or keep thinking. But think about matching your feedback to all of the other activities you're doing as well. And just like you would in any other class, be sure to norm grading and scoring with the TAs so you're ensuring that the students have equitable experiences. So get your TAs together in a room, pull copies of discussion board posts, and have them grade, have all of the TAs grade the same posts and see where it shakes out, and have discussions with your TAs about making sure that that's fair and equitable.
So there are a couple of different considerations to think about when you're setting things up in Canvas. The 2 key ones are how are you going to give students a grade on things, and how are you going to give them comments. So when you set up a discussion in Canvas, you saw how we put in the graded. You can set up a custom grading scale, and you can't fully see it because I did the brilliant thing of hiding this lower image with the upper image. But you can set up a custom grade scale so that the grade scale is actually check, plus, and minus, right? You can also set that up so that when you're grading through the gradebook, you can just click a drop down and you can click whichever option you prefer to give the students. When you're accessing the discussion in SpeedGrader, which again, there's some information about creating rubrics and adding a grading scheme, and you'll see a link for accessing the discussion and speed grader in a moment. You can put in comments as well. And this is what a rubric might look like. It is not necessarily in Canvas. This is just kind of giving you a feel for the types of things that you might want to include in your rubric. The link to this rubric is actually in the middle section here, the sample discussion rubric. But you can effectively set up your rubric to say whatever you would like to score the students on. And again, because you've got your purpose in mind by now, and you're like, I can hear Erica and Karen saying, remember your purpose. You can set up those criteria and the grading scales in the way that makes the most sense for what you're looking to accomplish in that discussion.
Any questions about giving feedback? Or any lingering questions? I think this is our last Q&A before we end. We can also stick around for a few minutes and answer last minute questions, but any questions before we wrap up? All right.
A question?
Oh, all right. Hi, Cindy.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I feel really foolish about asking this because I know it's been explained, but my internet cut out a little bit, and I feel really foolish, but
No.
I'm still struggling with the concept of groups and group sets. And I was wondering if I don't know, maybe I should do this in a private appointment. I'd like to see how a group is set up as compared to how a group set is set up. Maybe it would help me conceptualize better what they're for.
So Cindy, if you are going to be around for a few minutes, how about if I show you after we run through the rest of the slides?
Outstanding. Thank you.
Yeah, we can do a screen share. Yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, and I just want to agree with what Matt said. There's definitely no foolish. You are learning all kinds of new things and a lot of stuff coming at y'all. So please don't worry about any of the questions.
Lots of new information happening really quickly.
Yeah. Well, and higher ed changes quickly, easily, right?
For sure. All right, cool. So wrapping up, again, remember just to be intentional in your setup, implementation, and scoring of discussion boards. Encourage students to explore lots of ways to respond to prompts in each other. The more explicit and creative you can be in your word choice, the more interesting their engagement with you and with the material and with each other it will be. Remember to think about how your discussion boards connect to other assignments and learning assignments or learning activities that you're doing in the class. Make sure that it's all part of this larger constellation of learning activities that they're doing in your course. And then give students, this is a really, really important thing to try to give students a lower no-stakes discussion board in week 1 so that they can play around with the technology. And so here's 2 maybe starter pack of low-stakes discussion board questions. So we've tried this with our undergraduate writing consultants, and it prompted many a furious debate. Is cereal a kind of soup? Their response is to explain their answer, and their replies are to rebut and to debate the logic or the rationale. Or what's a book that you enthusiastically recommend? Explain your recommendation, and then reply if you're interested. What about that recommendation is speaking to you? So these are 2 examples of a really low stakes question that you could ask in week 1 just to have students try out different ways of answering, try out answering each other. You could say with the enthusiastically recommend, the book you recommend, post a copy of the book, an image of the book cover, or links to videos of the author talking about the book. You could have students engage in multimedia with this as well. All right. And of course, reach out to us. I know people can stick around and we'll show how to set up groups, but we're here to talk with you. We can talk with you individually. If you have co-instructors that you're working with or TAs and you want us to have a group meeting with all of y'all, we totally can. So here's our contact information. And ed tech services, ETS, they're the ones who basically run Canvas. So if you have really technical questions or if you're really confused about Canvas, the team over at EdTech is amazing, and they can work with you about all of the different questions that you have.